What if the story of our world is far older than anything we were ever taught? What if the continents we know, the cities we build, and even the memories we inherit are only the newest layer of a planet that has lived many lives before us? Sometimes, in the quiet moments between waking and sleep, the earth seems to whisper fragments of a forgotten past. A past buried not by time alone, but perhaps by something more deliberate, more guarded. Across deserts, beneath oceans, under mountains of ice, scattered clues lie in wait. A carved stone whose style should not exist in its era. A ruin aligned too precisely with the stars. Layers of soil disturbed by a catastrophe no text ever recorded. And the silence, the strange silence that surrounds entire chapters of history where cultures rose and vanished without a trace, their knowledge dissolved as though someone had swept a hand across the slate of time. Were these merely accidents of nature, the churn of climate and geology? Or did the earth witness cycles of civilization long before the ones we call ancient? Civilizations erased by floods, by fire, by shifting poles, or by the quiet intention of those who survived them. As we drift deeper into this night's journey, we will follow the fractures in the historical record, the cracks where forgotten light still flickers. We will ask, not for certainty, but for the courage to wonder. Welcome to Cryptic Realm Channel, where we explore the hidden past of ancient Earth. Let us begin. There is a quiet unease that settles in when you place the age of the Earth beside the age of our own species. 4.5 billion years of planetary history on one side, and on the other, a few 100,000 years of Homo sapiens. A few million if you stretch back to our earliest upright ancestors. On a calendar where the planet's life is compressed into a single year, all of recorded human history appears in the last few seconds before midnight. In that long, dim expanse before us, the rocks have carried oceans. Mountains have risen and vanished. Climates have swung from furnace to ice. And we assume, almost casually, that nothing like us ever walked here before. How could we be so sure? Geology teaches that the Earth is not a static stage, but a restless actor. The continents are not fixed continents at all, but rafts of rock drifting on a slow-moving mantle. This is the theory of plate tectonics. Huge slabs of crust that slide, collide, are pushed upward into mountains or dragged downward into the deep mantle in subduction zones. The seafloor we know today is astonishingly young. Most of the oceanic crust is less than 200 million years old, wiped and rewritten over and over again by the conveyor belt of spreading and subduction. Even on land, the surface is endlessly sanded down by wind, water, ice. Erosion cuts valleys, fills basins, hides traces. If you imagine a city of steel and concrete, left alone for 1 million years, then another million, then 10, you begin to feel how fragile our presence really is. This sense of fragility was what stirred two scientists, the astrophysicist Adam Frank and the climate scientist Gavin Schmidt, to entertain a question that sounds, at first, like science fiction. In 2018, they published a paper with a deliberately provocative title, The Silurian Hypothesis. Would it be possible to detect an industrial civilization in the geological record? The name was a playful nod to a British science fiction series, but the reasoning behind it was strictly sober. If an industrial civilization had arisen on Earth millions of years before humans and had then disappeared, would the rocks remember? They did not argue that such a civilization existed. They asked whether, if it had, we would even know. The more they examined our own footprint, the more elusive it seemed. Human cities, infrastructure, technology, almost all of it is temporary on geological timescales. Concrete breaks down, metals corrode, plastics degrade, even glass returns to grains. Fossilization, the process that turns bone or wood into stone, is rare and selective. Only a tiny fraction of living beings become fossils, mostly those buried quickly in the right sediments. Our skyscrapers, our highways, our machines. After a few million years, they would likely be gone, ground into dust, and swept into new layers. Just another contribution to the anonymous rubble. So they turned away from objects and toward chemistry. If you cannot count on buildings or bones, perhaps you can search for signals in the very composition of sediments and ice. Industrial civilization, as we know it, leaves certain fingerprints. A sharp rise in carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, with a distinctive shift in the ratio of carbon isotopes. Traces of synthetic compounds that do not occur in nature. Spikes in heavy nitrogen from artificial fertilizers. And, more ominously, the long-lived daughters of nuclear fission. Isotopes that linger for millions of years. Carbon, for instance, comes in different isotopic forms, the lighter carbon-12 and the heavier carbon-13. Plants prefer the lighter form when they photosynthesize. When we burn fossil fuels, ancient plant matter, we flood the atmosphere with carbon that is especially rich in carbon-12. In ice cores and marine sediments, this shows up as a detectable change in the carbon isotope ratio, a chemical echo of our engines and power plants. Could some earlier, unknown industry have left a similar signal long before humans? The same question extends to nitrogen. Modern agriculture uses manufactured fertilizers, fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere and spreading it across the land. This process leaves its own subtle isotopic footprints, a rearrangement of nitrogen-15 in soils and sediments. If some other civilization had industrialized the land, intensified agriculture on a planetary scale, might their fields have whispers in the isotope record, thin bands buried deep below our feet? Then there is the shadow of nuclear technology. When uranium atoms split in reactors or bombs, they create a suite of new isotopes, some of them with extremely long half-lives. Iodine-129, for example, persists for tens of millions of years. A civilization that embraced nuclear power or nuclear war would seed the rocks with a strange constellation of radionuclides, rare or absent in purely natural conditions. If we found a layer rich in such isotopes, far older than any human experiment, what would we make of it? A natural anomaly, a cosmic event, or something more unsettling? And yet, nature itself is not silent. Massive volcanic eruptions can release vast amounts of carbon, changing isotope ratios without a single machine involved. Climate shocks, like the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum 56 million years ago, show dramatic warmth and carbon spikes that can be explained by methane release or long-term volcanism. Even nuclear-like reactions have occurred in nature. 2 billion years ago, in what is now Gabon, natural uranium deposits achieved a self-sustaining fission reaction, a kind of spontaneous reactor in the rock. The Earth, on its own, can mimic many of the chemical signatures we might imagine as technological. So the question remains, hovering over the slow breathing of the planet, if there had been others before us, driven by fire and chemistry and ambition, would we be able to disentangle their traces from the restless patterns of geology? Or has deep time already folded them into its own pulse so completely that what we call natural history might, in some hidden layers, be something else entirely? Something subtle begins to shift when we ponder the possibility that the Earth may have lived through cycles of rise and erasure long before the first human carved a tool or lit a fire. The rocks, after all, do not speak in sentences. They murmur in fragments, in imperfect layers, in the scars of vanished oceans and the faint residues of ancient atmospheres. And yet, scattered across the geological record, are moments when the planet seemed to convulse, when warmth surged abruptly, when species vanished in cascades, and when new forms of life emerged as though stepping into a world recently emptied. One of those moments, curious and unsettling, lies about 56 million years beneath our feet. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. An abrupt warming of 5 to 8 degrees Celsius, oceans heated to tropical levels, the poles unfrozen, and carbon released into the atmosphere in quantities so vast that Earth entered a greenhouse state for nearly 200,000 years. Its cause is debated. Volcanism, methane hydrates, orbital changes. Each theory explains parts of the puzzle. None captures it fully. And in this incomplete explanation, some detect not proof, but possibility. A faint space where questions can breathe. It is not that anyone claims the Petum was the work of machines or factories predating humans. The scientific consensus holds steady. Natural processes, amplified over long spans, can reshape climate in dramatic ways. Yet what lingers is the realization that our own industrial fingerprint, a surge of carbon, a warming exceeding predictions, a chemical shift in the air itself, mirrors patterns Earth has known before. If nature can create these signatures without us, then the inverse is also worth considering. If someone else once left a signal of their presence, could we mistake it for nature? Could the Earth's turbulence become a veil, concealing the traces of something that lived, flourished, and burned out in a forgotten epoch? That thought alone is enough to unsettle the quiet certainty with which we chart human origins. Archaeology, paleontology, anthropology, they illuminate tens of thousands of years with remarkable clarity. They trace the migration of early Homo sapiens out of Africa, the development of tools, the taming of fire, the rise of symbolic art and ritual. But their illumination dims rapidly as we reach beyond the boundaries of our species, beyond the delicate bones that fossilization rarely spares. The further back we look, the sparser the evidence becomes, until the deep past resembles a night sky, with only a few distant stars to navigate by. And in that darkness, we sometimes mistake the absence of proof for proof of absence. This is where geology and imagination meet, and where caution must walk beside wonder. When we search for the earliest signs of intelligent organization, patterns of coordination, behavior that hints at complex thinking, we often encounter species we once underestimated. Elephants mourn their dead. Crows craft tools from twigs and wire. Octopuses solve puzzles and navigate labyrinths. Dolphins call each other by unique names. Intelligence does not move in a straight line from simple to complex. It branches, blooms unexpectedly, hides in unexpected forms. And among the ancient animals that walked the earth long before humans, there is one group whose potential continues to spark debate: the dinosaurs. For more than a century, they were depicted as lumbering beasts, instinctive, slow, driven more by survival than by thought. But discoveries across the last few decades have softened that image. Studies of hadrosaur nesting grounds reveal repeated returns to the same sites, suggesting memory, planning, and social coordination. Fossils of troodontids show large brain cavities relative to body size, grasping hands, binocular vision, traits that, in mammals and birds, correlate with problem-solving and cooperative behavior. Paleontologists like Dale Russell once proposed a speculative evolutionary path. If the asteroid had not ended the Cretaceous, perhaps troodontids might have continued evolving toward ever greater cognitive sophistication. It is conjecture, yes, but it springs from an honest scientific observation. Intelligence is not uniquely human, nor uniquely mammalian. It is a potential the Earth has explored many times. And if the Earth has explored it before, where might that exploration have led? Could intelligence arise, expand, and vanish without leaving monuments? Would a species bound not by hands, but by something else, claws, beaks, tentacles, create tools we would recognize? Or would their artifacts crumble beyond recognition, their settlements erased by time, their signals buried beneath shifting sediments? We may never know. But the possibility lingers, faint but persistent, like a ripple beneath calm water. And as we listen to the rocks and the records of ancient climates, another question begins to form. Not whether intelligence existed before us, but whether we would ever notice if it had. There is a strange comfort in believing that history is linear, that life progresses in a single upward arc from the primitive to the advanced, from darkness to knowing. Yet when we step back and examine the deep gallery of life, a different rhythm emerges, one of ascent and collapse, emergence and disappearance. Civilizations in the human era have risen and crumbled in spans as brief as a millennium, sometimes less. Why then do we assume that on a planet as ancient as this, intelligence, whatever shape it may have taken, would surface only once? That assumption begins to waver when we turn our gaze toward the world's great myths, those enduring stories that arrived before writing, before agriculture, passed from mouth to mouth until they hardened into tradition. Among these echoes, there is one tale that intrigues scholars and dreamers alike: the idea of a lost continent, a motherland swallowed by the sea. One version of that story bears the name Mu. The notion entered popular imagination in the late 19th century when Augustus Le Plongeon, a photographer and amateur antiquarian, claimed to have deciphered ancient Maya texts describing an advanced civilization that perished in a cataclysm long before recorded history. His interpretation was quickly rejected by linguists, yet his ideas lingered, amplified later by James Churchward, who spoke of clay tablets shown to him by a temple priest in India. Churchward wrote that these tablets told of Mu, a vast landmass in the Pacific Ocean, home to millions of people and a culture more advanced than any known civilization. He described its cities, its spiritual practices, its sudden destruction, submerged in a single night by earthquakes and volcanic fire. Critics dismissed his works as invention, pointing out the absence of archaeological proof, the geological implausibility of a vanished continent of such size. But the imagery he painted struck a nerve, not because it was proven, but because it touched a deeper yearning. The sense that beneath our feet lies a story far longer than we remember. The Pacific itself feeds that yearning. It is an ocean of quiet immensities, its floor riven with trenches and volcanic arcs, its islands hinting at histories that stretch beyond the reach of written records. Archaeological discoveries in places like Nan Madol, the sprawling basalt city built atop coral reefs in Micronesia, stir questions about ancient engineering prowess. The moai of Rapa Nui, carved from volcanic tuff and transported across miles of rugged terrain, reflect a level of organization, labor, and belief that challenges assumptions about so-called isolated island cultures. And on some Pacific islands, oral traditions speak of migrations from lands that sank beneath the horizon, of ancestors who fled rising waters or trembling earth. These stories cannot be taken as literal chronicles of a vanished supercontinent, but neither can they be dismissed outright. For oral memory often preserves kernels of events, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, sea level rise that occurred thousands of years ago. The geological truth is more subtle than the sweeping drama of an entire continent swallowed whole. The Pacific Basin is shaped by subduction and volcanism, processes that constantly recycle crust. It is unlikely that a landmass the size of Asia ever existed there in the recent geological past. Yet there were once expansive regions of land now drowned by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. Sundaland in Southeast Asia, for example, where human communities thrived in coastal plains, now lying beneath warm, shallow waters. Could memories of these submerged landscapes have traveled across generations, transforming slowly into myth? Could the sense of a lost homeland, swallowed by the sea, echo something real, even if not on the continental scale Churchward imagined? There is another way to read the myth of Mu, not as literal geography, but as symbolic memory of a cultural horizon erased or forgotten. The ancient world was threaded with trade routes long before the rise of the major empires we study today. Ideas, motifs, and technologies traveled far, carried by sailors and storytellers. If an early maritime culture once spread its knowledge widely, leaving traces in architecture, cosmology, or ritual practices across distant shores, and then declined or dispersed, might later generations reinterpret that absence as the loss of a great mother civilization? Myth often begins in the space left behind by forgotten realities. Still, the silence remains. No ruins beneath the Pacific waves reveal a forgotten empire. No inscriptions speak definitively of a land called Mu And yet, when we look at the scattered clues across islands, at the megalithic structures whose original purposes are obscured, at the deep-sea maps that hint at drowned shelves and ancient shorelines, a faint impression forms, not of a single lost continent, but of many lost worlds, erased by tides of time. And as we hold that impression lightly in our hands, another question rises, unbidden. If the stories of Mu endure not because they are factual, but because they echo a deeper pattern of loss, what other memories of the ancient earth might we have mistaken for myth? There is a moment when following the trail of lost homelands, where one myth gives way to another, older, sharper, and far more intricately woven into the intellectual history of the West. Long before Churchward spoke of Mu, long before 19th century explorers projected their dreams onto the Pacific, there was a Greek philosopher who whispered of a civilization so advanced, so radiant in power and knowledge, that its downfall became a warning for all ages. Atlantis, a name that still stirs something deep in us, not because we expect to find its marble halls intact beneath the waves, but because its absence feels deliberate, curated, almost as though it were meant to linger as a shadow rather than a memory. When Plato introduced Atlantis in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, he framed it not as invention, but as a tale transmitted through priests in Egypt to the Athenian statesman Solon, who in turn carried it home to Greece. A story of an island empire beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the Strait of Gibraltar, larger than Libya and Asia combined. A power that spanned continents, whose kings were heirs of Poseidon, whose architecture gleamed with precious metals, whose laws maintained harmony for generations. Until, as Plato says, the divine portion in them faded, and ambition swelled beyond wisdom. Most scholars view Atlantis as allegory, a parable about hubris. Yet even allegories draw their force from something familiar. The curious part lies less in the splendor Plato describes than in the specific geographic framing, the exact measurements, the political structure laid out with unusual detail. Why did he anchor a moral lesson in such precise language? Why set it in a distant epoch, 9,000 years before Solon's time, far older than any known Greek civilization? And why, above all, give it such a dramatic end? Earthquakes, floods, a single day and night in which Atlantis vanished beneath the sea. The Mediterranean world preserves echoes of disasters that could seed myth. The eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 BCE, unleashed a cataclysm that devastated the flourishing Minoan civilization. Its ash clouds, tsunamis, and economic collapse rippled across the Aegean, altering trade networks and cultural dominance. Archaeologists uncovered at Akrotiri a city frozen mid-motion, its frescoes vibrant, its streets orderly, its walls still standing after 3.5 millennia. A civilization halted as if by a sudden, insistent hand. While the Minoans were hardly 9,000 years older than Solon's era, the memory of such a devastating event could, over centuries, grow into legend. Yet Atlantis carries a sense of distance that seems to point beyond the Aegean. It resonates with stories far older than Greek memory. Flood narratives from Mesopotamia, the biblical deluge, the Zoroastrian tale of a world lost to winter and rising waters, the Vedic accounts of Manu saved from a cosmic flood. Nearly every ancient culture nurtures a tale of a golden age undone by water, of lands swallowed, of knowledge scattered. The similarities are striking enough that scholars of myth, like Mircea Eliade and Joseph Campbell, wondered whether all these stories reflect shared cultural roots or shared environmental trauma. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, drowning coastlines where early human communities once lived. Entire plains, river valleys, and coastal settlements disappeared beneath waters that crept, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly, into human worlds. Could the memory of a drowned world linger across millennia, fragmented into dozens of myths? Could Plato have inherited an echo of that deep ancestral loss, reshaped into the image of a fallen empire? Many have speculated, but speculation often reveals more about human longing than about ancient geography. And still, there are anomalies that draw the curious back to the mystery. Structures along the coasts of India, like those off the Gulf of Cambay, where sonar imaging revealed geometric patterns on the seabed, though their interpretation remains controversial. Submerged ruins near Pavlopetri in Greece, dating to the Bronze Age, preserved in remarkable detail. The enigmatic Yonaguni Monument off Japan's shores, with its terraces and steps carved in ways that seem both natural and modified. These are not Atlantis. No responsible scholar claims they are. But they remind us that human settlement once touched lands now drowned, that civilizations rise in places later claimed by tides, that absence is not always proof of non-existence. Perhaps that is why Atlantis endures, not as a fixed location to be found, but as a symbol of civilizations erased by forces greater than themselves. It lingers just out of reach, at the intersection of myth and memory, a whisper suggesting that the story of humanity is not as complete as we think. And as the waves close over another night in our imagination, we are left wondering if a world as magnificent as Atlantis had once stood, powerful and proud, and had fallen quietly into the sea, how much of its story would truly remain, and how much would dissolve into the murmuring silence of deep water? There are places on Earth where the land itself seems to hold its breath, where the contours of valleys and the shapes of stones hint at stories older than human memory. Long before Atlantis ignited the imagination of philosophers, long before the rise of historic kingdoms, there were floodplains carved by forces so immense that they reshaped continents in days. They do not appear in myth alone. They are written into the terrain. One such place lies in the state of Washington, where the channeled scablands stretch like a labyrinth of scars across basalt plains. For decades, geologists puzzled over this bizarre landscape. Dry cataracts large enough to dwarf modern waterfalls, coulees carved like the paths of vanished rivers, ripple marks the size of buildings hardened into rock. None of it fit the slow, patient processes that usually sculpt Earth's face. Then, in the early 20th century, a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed something radical: that the region had been shaped by a flood of unimaginable scale, a deluge unleashed when a glacial dam on prehistoric Lake Missoula suddenly failed. His colleagues ridiculed him. Such catastrophic thinking, they argued, belonged to the myths of ancient cultures, not to scientific geology. Yet decades later, with aerial photography and field evidence mounting. Bretz's vision proved correct. That revelation unsettled a certainty long held by science, that change is always slow, incremental, predictable. The scablands showed otherwise. They showed that the Earth is capable of sudden upheavals, events swift enough to erase landscapes, and perhaps whatever had stood upon them. Some researchers, noting the timing of these floods around the end of the last ice age, wondered whether similar catastrophes might lie beneath the flood myths shared across distant civilizations. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of waters rising to swallow mountains. The Hebrew Bible describes 40 days and nights of rain, a world washed clean. Hindu traditions tell of Manu rescued from a great flood by a divine being. In each story, the world before the waters disappears, and the world after begins anew. A pattern uncannily parallel to the geological record of global sea level rise between 12 and 8,000 years ago. The resonance is not exact, but it is suggestive. Could the sinking of coastal settlements, the drowning of fertile plains, the loss of entire cultural horizons in the wake of melting ice sheets have imprinted itself on collective memory? Archaeology has uncovered evidence of ancient peoples living on shorelines now submerged by tens of meters of water. Pavlopetri, off the coast of Greece, is one such example. A Bronze Age city whose stone outlines lie perfectly preserved beneath the Mediterranean, its streets still discernible after 5,000 years. Doggerland, once a vast land bridge between Britain and continental Europe, is another. Its forests, rivers, and human habitations vanish beneath rising seas, leaving traces only in fishing nets and seafloor cores. These places remind us that human history is not fixed to the land we see today. It is bound to landscapes we have lost. But what of the deeper question? The one that threads through every whisper of lost worlds. If a culture more advanced than its peers had once flourished in those vanished regions, would we ever know? The oceans conceal more than they reveal. Their floors are mapped more poorly than the surfaces of distant planets, and artifacts lying beneath silt and currents endure in silence. Even on land, erosion and tectonics can bury or distort the traces of early civilizations. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey lay hidden for millennia beneath an artificial hill. Its monolithic pillars older than Stonehenge and the pyramids, suggesting a level of social organization previously unimagined for its era. If such a site could vanish from sight for 12,000 years, what else might lie hidden, awaiting the accident of discovery? Yet it is equally true that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In the absence of clear artifacts, we are left with landscapes that look almost intentional in their strangeness, myths that echo one another across continents, and geological events so vast they might erase entire chapters of human or pre-human effort. The temptation is strong to weave these threads into a single tapestry, to imagine that the scablands and their kin are not merely natural catastrophes, but markers of something lost, something erased so completely that only the violence of its ending remains. Still, the earth keeps its secrets with a patient indifference. Bretz's floods were real, but they tell only of water and ice, not of forgotten cities. Pavlopetri sank beneath the waves, but its story begins in the Bronze Age, not in epochs unknown. And yet, when we stand upon the basalt cliffs and look across the carved channels, it is difficult not to wonder whether the scars of the planet preserve more than we dare admit. If a world once stood on those ancient plains, its stones swept away in a surge no witness survived, would we recognize the absence, or would we mistake it, as we so often do, for the quiet handiwork of nature alone? There are other mysteries, quieter, but no less unsettling, that rise not from shattered plains or drowned coastlines, but from the deep ocean floor itself. In the early 2000s, researchers conducting sonar surveys off the coast of India detected something unexpected in the murky waters of the Gulf of Cambay. Linear arrangements of structures, right angles where none should exist, and patterns beneath the silt that resembled the outlines of streets. The water was turbulent, thick with sediment, difficult to investigate directly. Yet the preliminary scans ignited a spark of speculation. Could these be remnants of a settlement many thousands of years old, older perhaps than the Indus Valley civilizations that once flourished nearby? When divers recovered artifacts, pottery shards, stones that seemed shaped, they were found in sediments dated far earlier than any known Indian urban culture. But sediment is not architecture, and ocean currents are unreliable custodians of chronology. Skeptics argued that the items might have been transported from elsewhere, that the seabed formations could be natural. The debate remained unresolved, hanging in that nebulous space where evidence is tantalizing but insufficient, where the sea itself obscures what we most wish to see. A similar ambiguity hovers around the Yonaguni Monument off Japan's Okinawa Prefecture. Discovered in 1985 by a diver exploring the coastal seabed, the structure appears at first glance to be a series of enormous step terraces, broad platforms, sharp-edged tiers, vertical walls rising like the base of a forgotten ziggurat. Some features resemble what one might call corridors or pillars. Others echo natural sedimentary formations that break into geometric forms under tectonic stress. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura championed the idea that Yonaguni bears human modification, pointing to tool marks he believed were carved into the stone. Most geologists disagreed, citing the rock's natural fracture patterns. The monument sits in a liminal place between geology and imagination, a reminder of how eagerly the mind fills voids with meaning, but also how the Earth's own artistry can mimic the work of ancient hands. Even if these formations prove natural, they touch upon something deeper. The sea has swallowed entire worlds, some human, some pre-human, leaving behind only whispers. Off the coast of Egypt, the sunken city of Heraklion once lay hidden until its rediscovery in the early 2000s. Its statues and temples preserved in a silence unbroken for over 1,000 years. Off Greece, near the island of Delos, divers found the ruins of ancient harbors and warehouses long buried beneath silt. These are known civilizations, their histories recorded, their identities secure. But their presence beneath the waves hints at a truth easily forgotten. The ocean is an archivist of both the remembered and the erased. Beneath this reality lies another tension, between evidence that can be touched and questions that cannot. The end of the last ice age reshaped coastlines around the world, inundating lowlands where early cultures are believed to have settled. Archaeologists have long suspected that some of the earliest human communities may lie offshore, sealed away in submerged valleys and deltas that once nurtured life along rivers now claimed by the sea. The difficulty is not in believing this, but in proving it. Underwater excavation is slow, costly, and technically demanding. Most of the ocean floor remains unmapped at high resolution. What we do know is patchwork. What we do not know stretches into darkness. And so, the mysteries accumulate. They do not confirm the existence of advanced civilizations lost to deep time, but they complicate the clean narrative of human origins. A structure here, an anomaly there, a myth that seems too persistent to ignore. All of it forms a haze at the edge of understanding. A reminder that our species walks on a world shaped by forces that have erased much and preserved little. It becomes difficult not to consider a question that feels both audacious and strangely reasonable. If countless human settlements disappeared beneath rising seas just 10 or 12,000 years ago, how many more could have vanished in far older ages, long before humans arrived, leaving traces even harder to decipher? These submerged landscapes form a border between what is known and what is possible, a threshold where absence can be mistaken for emptiness. And as we stare into that threshold, letting our thoughts sink as slowly as sediment drifting to the seafloor, we are left wondering whether the stories we search for have already dissolved into the deep, or whether they wait, patient and unread, for the rare moment when the ocean yields its secrets to the light. There are moments in the study of ancient worlds when the ground beneath our assumptions begins to shift, not because of mythology or speculation, but because of discoveries that refuse to fit neatly into the frameworks we have built. One of these moments unfolded in the mid-1990s on a quiet hill in southeastern Turkey, where a Kurdish shepherd noticed stones protruding from the earth, stones carved with strange precision. Archaeologists soon uncovered what we now call Göbekli Tepe, a circular sanctuary of massive T-shaped pillars arranged in rings, some rising more than 5 meters high. Their surfaces bear carvings of animals, foxes, lions, cranes, snakes, rendered with a symbolic intent that suggests more than simple decoration. Radiocarbon dating revealed something astonishing. These megaliths were erected around 9600 BCE, millennia before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before pottery, metallurgy, or formal agriculture. Here was monumental architecture built by hunter-gatherers, a fact that overturned long-held assumptions about the sequence of human development. The site seemed almost to defy the timeline, as though a chapter of human capability had surfaced out of place. What makes Göbekli Tepe so compelling is not simply its age, but the mystery of its purpose. It was not a village. There were no traces of houses, hearths, or daily living. Instead, it appears to have been a ritual center, a place where communities gathered from across the region for reasons we can only guess. Ceremonies, feasts, initiation rites. Its construction required coordination, planning, and knowledge of stonecraft far more sophisticated than expected for its era. And curiously, after centuries of use, the people who built it deliberately buried it under tons of stone and sediment, sealing it as though preserving it for a future they could not foresee. Why bury a place of such significance? Did its meaning change? Was it protected or abandoned or concealed? Nearby discoveries at sites like Karahan Tepe and Navali Chori deepen the mystery, showing that Göbekli Tepe was not an anomaly, but part of a broader cultural horizon stretching across southeastern Anatolia. This horizon emerged just as the Younger Dryas, a period of dramatic cooling, ended. An era marked by climatic turbulence that reshaped ecosystems and may have forced human groups to adapt in ways we do not fully understand. Some researchers wonder whether the social organization required to build such monuments was itself a response to environmental upheaval, a way for scattered bands to bind themselves together as the world warmed and changed. Others consider whether the sophistication of these structures hints at knowledge carried from older traditions now lost to time. The animals carved on the pillars are not merely decorative. They appear in combinations that suggest symbolic systems or mythic narratives. Some pillars show vultures carrying spheres, a motif that appears in later Near Eastern cultures as a symbol of soul or sky. One enclosure's arrangement of pillars has been interpreted by some scholars as astronomical, aligned with particular stars or constellations, though such claims remain contested. The site forces us to confront the possibility that prehistoric people possessed a symbolic and ritual complexity long before agriculture reshaped human societies. Perhaps, instead of ritual emerging from settled life, it was ritual that encouraged settlement, people gathering first for ceremony and only later turning to cultivation to support those gatherings. Yet even as Göbekli Tepe illuminates, it casts shadows. If such architecture arose so early, does it stand alone, a brilliant and isolated spark? Or is it one surviving fragment of a broader tapestry now mostly erased by the passage of 12 millennia? The deliberate burial preserves it, but also suggests that countless other sites, less carefully entombed, more vulnerable to erosion and time, might have vanished without leaving a trace. What would our understanding look like if even a handful of those had survived? Would the standard narrative of human origins appear as complete as we believe? Standing amid the uncovered pillars, one senses that the site is both revelation and reminder. A revelation that ancient people were capable of immense coordination long before expected, and a reminder that our knowledge of deep history rests on fragments. When those fragments shift, so too does our perception of the human story. And as we look upon the carved animals frozen in stone, the question that lingers is not merely how they were made, but what else remains hidden, buried by intention or by time, waiting to upend our assumptions once again. There are discoveries that do not sit quietly in the drawers of museums, that refuse to behave like ordinary artifacts. Some are not monumental, like Göbekli Tepe, not vast enough to reshape landscapes, but instead appear in scattered objects, enigmatic, unclassifiable, almost intrusive in their strangeness. They surface in layers where they should not exist, in materials that do not match their time, or in shapes that echo across continents without explanation. Archaeologists call them out-of-place artifacts, though the term itself is often whispered with caution because most such claims unravel under scrutiny. Yet a few persist, not as proof of forgotten civilizations, but as quiet provocations, reminding us that the archaeological record is profoundly incomplete and shaped by chance more than certainty. Among these curious remnants is a simple mechanism pulled from the depths of the Aegean Sea, a corroded cluster of bronze gears recovered from a shipwreck off the island of Antikythera at the turn of the 20th century. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just another artifact among statues and amphorae. Only later did X-ray imaging reveal its true nature, a complex astronomical calculator capable of tracking planetary motions, eclipses, and calendars with astonishing precision. The Antikythera mechanism, as it is now known, dates to around the 2nd century BCE. Yet no other device of comparable sophistication is known for 1,000 years afterward. How did such a machine come into being? And why does it stand alone in its era, as though a window of advanced knowledge opened briefly and then closed? The answer, as scholars explain, lies in the lost works of Hellenistic engineers, traditions that may have flourished in workshops like those of Rhodes or Alexandria, preserved in texts now vanished. The mechanism is not evidence of a forgotten industrial age, but of a high point in ancient craftsmanship whose artifacts seldom survived. Still, its uniqueness stirs an unsettling thought. If a device as intricate as this could nearly vanish from history, rediscovered only by accident beneath the sea, how many other innovations, less durable, less fortunate, were lost entirely? What does the archaeological silence hide, not by intention, but by the fragility of materials and the indifference of time? Similar questions arise when examining enigmatic structures scattered across the world. In Bolivia, at the site of Pumapunku, stone blocks weighing tens of tons lie scattered as though toppled by a force beyond mere abandonment. Their surfaces bear right angles and interlocking cuts so precise that engineers once marveled at the craftsmanship. The stones are made of andesite, a hard volcanic rock that requires significant skill to shape even with modern tools. Archaeologists attribute the site to the Tiwanaku culture, flourishing between the 6th and 10th centuries CE, but some aspects remain puzzling. The methods used to transport and sculpt the stones are not fully understood, not because they were impossible, but because the Tiwanaku left no written records explaining their techniques. Their knowledge, like that of so many ancient cultures, slipped away with their decline. Over time, speculation filled the vacuum, projecting imaginative narratives onto the ruins. Yet the true story is likely one of human ingenuity applied with patience, coordination, and a mastery of local stonecraft that later generations did not retain. In a different corner of the world stands another enigma, the megalithic spheres of Costa Rica. Perfect or near-perfect stone spheres, some reaching 2 meters in diameter, dot the landscape of the Dikis Delta. Created by the indigenous Chibchan cultures between the 1st millennium BCE and the early 2nd millennium CE, their purpose remains a subject of debate. Markers of status, astronomical alignments, symbolic guardians of settlements. They reveal an understanding of geometry and stonework that developed independently of old world traditions, reminding us that sophisticated craftsmanship appears wherever humans invest meaning into matter. Yet the spheres, like the blocks of Pumapunku, carry a haunting simplicity. The people who made them left no written explanations. Their stories must be reconstructed from fragments, guesses, and analogies. This pattern, flashes of advanced knowledge arising, fading, and leaving only mute traces, echoes across human history. Civilizations achieve mastery in particular domains, only for those skills to be forgotten or transformed when societies shift. Bronze casting techniques lost after the fall of the Shang. Roman concrete formulas that disappeared for centuries. Medieval architectural knowledge that rose, waned, and revived. The record we inherit is not a smooth ascent, but a jagged line of peaks and valleys. Perhaps what unsettles us is not the artifacts themselves, but the voids around them. The sense that brilliance is fragile, that entire chapters of innovation can crumble and vanish without a sound. And so we return to the unsettling possibility that shadows every remarkable discovery. If human cultures can lose knowledge within a few generations, if entire technological traditions can disappear within centuries, what might have vanished across tens of thousands of years, or millions? What kinds of stories, what feats of craft, what early experiments in understanding the world might lie buried beyond reach, erased not by conspiracy, but by the slow turning of the earth? As we contemplate these silent artifacts, half preserved and half forgotten, another question rises like a faint echo in the dark. Is it the rarity of evidence that limits our understanding, or the limits of our imagination when faced with what little remains? There are regions of the world where silence feels cultivated rather than accidental, where ruins seem to hold their breath as though guarding stories meant only to be glimpsed, never fully understood. High in the Peruvian Andes, on wind-swept plateaus, where the air thins and the horizon sharpens, lies one such place, the ancient site of Sacsayhuaman. At first glance, it appears as a fortress, its walls rising in zigzag patterns of cyclopean stone. But take a closer look, and the stones themselves begin to unsettle the mind. Some are as tall as houses, weighing more than 100 tons, yet they are fitted with joints so precise that a blade cannot slip between them. Their edges curve subtly, locking into neighboring stones, with a complexity that feels almost engineered rather than carved. Archaeologists attribute the work to the Inca, whose empire flourished in the 15th century. But the Incas themselves spoke of Sacsayhuaman as the work of an earlier people, a culture they revered but did not fully understand. Oral traditions insist that these megaliths predate the empire, that the Inca merely built upon foundations they found, inheriting a legacy as mysterious to them as it is to us. The same quiet puzzle emerges in other Andean sites. Ollantaytambo, with its terraces rising like great stairways into the mountains, features stone blocks relocated from quarries kilometers away, hauled across rivers and up steep slopes. Machu Picchu, perched on a narrow ridge, reveals not only exquisite masonry, but also an intimate understanding of the local environment. Water channels cut with mathematical precision, stairways aligned with astronomical markers, terraces designed to prevent landslides in a region of heavy rain. All of this speaks of mastery rather than magic, ingenuity rather than impossibility. Yet the deeper question remains: why do such extraordinary accomplishments emerge suddenly in certain cultures, peak with breathtaking clarity, and then fade into obscurity once the society collapses? What happens to the knowledge that built such monuments when the hands that shaped them vanish? In some cases, the disappearance was swift, driven by conquest or disease. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas triggered demographic collapse on a scale so vast that entire traditions were silenced within a generation. Rituals, engineering techniques, astronomical knowledge, much of it was lost before it could be recorded. The Incas kept quipu, knotted cords that served as accounting and possibly narrative devices, but their meaning was never fully deciphered before the empire fell. What remains are stones and terraces, silent achievements whose instruction manuals were effectively erased. But even before European contact, the Andes had witnessed cycles of rise and decline. The Tiwanaku, Wari, and Chavin cultures each rose to prominence, developed intricate art and architecture, then declined or transformed for reasons still debated: climatic shifts, resource depletion, internal conflict. With each fall, knowledge dissolved, leaving behind partial clues. Travel farther north to Mesoamerica, and the pattern repeats in different forms. The Maya built cities aligned with the movements of Venus and the sun, their temples rising from jungles like stone calendars. Their writing system, one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, was nearly obliterated when Spanish friars burned thousands of books, believing them pagan. Only a handful survived, and with them, fragments of a worldview now mostly reconstructed from inscriptions on monuments. The Maya collapse in the 9th century CE remains partially unexplained. Drought, warfare, political fragmentation each played a part. But the abrupt abandonment of great cities like Tikal and Copan still elicits wonder. How could a civilization with such astronomical insight, architectural brilliance, and artistic depth unravel so swiftly? And what did they take with them into oblivion that we no longer have the tools to decipher? Beneath these questions lies a deeper uncertainty. When a culture falls, the traces it leaves behind are shaped by chance. Some stones endure, some scripts escape destruction, some crafts persist through tradition, others vanish completely. What we call lost civilizations are often simply the result of asymmetrical preservation. We inherit the fragments durable enough to outlast centuries, while the more fragile strands of knowledge, stories, rituals, engineering techniques, cosmologies, dissolve into the soil or linger only in distant echoes of myth. The result is an uneven pattern that encourages speculation. Isolated marvels, standing amid long stretches of silence. If even the Inca left behind walls whose methods we still struggle to replicate, if the Maya's books were nearly erased, if entire cultures rose and fell without leaving written records, what would remain of a civilization far older, one living in a world reshaped by earthquakes, floods, or volcanic upheaval? The Andes teach us that knowledge can disappear quickly, that complexity can arise in isolation, and that brilliance can fade without warning. As we stand before the stones of Sacsayhuaman in the fading light, it is difficult not to wonder whether the story they hint at is only the last chapter of a much older tale, buried beneath centuries of loss, waiting for some future discovery to bring its earlier layers into view. There are landscapes where the earth seems to hum with old memory, where mountains rise like witnesses, and valleys hold echoes that do not belong solely to human history. Far to the north, at the edges of the Arctic Circle, lies one such realm, a place of ice and light, of vast silences broken only by wind, where traces of past warmth lie hidden beneath permafrost that has endured for millennia. It is a region that feels untouched, eternal, yet geological studies paint a different picture. The Arctic has not always been frozen. There were epochs when forests of cypress and redwood flourished where glaciers now stand, when rivers carried warm currents, when animals roamed a landscape unrecognizable to us. And within that ancient warmth lies one of the most enduring enigmas of myth: Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, described by Greek writers as a place of radiant people, untouched by sickness or age. Herodotus, Pindar, and Diodorus Siculus each spoke of the Hyperboreans with a tone unusual in Greek literature, less allegory than reverence, as though describing a distant but real cultural memory inherited from an earlier time. They wrote of a land bathed in perpetual sunlight, a people who lived in harmony with nature, sending offerings to Apollo through unknown northern routes. The Greeks themselves admitted that no traveler had ever reached this place. The winds and snows kept it hidden. Yet the details endure: its sacred groves, its temples of unearthly size, its inhabitants who lived beyond sorrow. What inspired such a consistent image among writers separated by centuries? Was it merely symbolic, or did some fragment of ancestral memory, carried across migrations and retellings, preserve a whisper of a time when the far north was warm, alive, and inhabited? Geologists have uncovered clues that complicate the border between myth and environment. During the Pliocene and early Pleistocene, the Arctic supported forests and wetlands. The poles experienced long summers of continuous light and winters less severe than today. Frozen mammoths, preserved with undigested flowers in their stomachs, suggest that abrupt climatic shifts once transformed lush grazing plains into fields of ice within a short span. These creatures, entombed mid-meal, evoke a world overturned suddenly. And the more we examine the layers of sediment and pollen trapped beneath the tundra, the more we find evidence of ecosystems that stood in stark contrast to the desolation we associate with the high north. Archaeology, however, tells a more cautious story. Human presence in the Arctic begins relatively late, long after the forests vanished and ice reclaimed the land. But the absence of evidence is not a verdict. It is a limitation. Rising seas, shifting ice sheets, and the grinding movements of glaciers could easily erase traces of ancient habitation. If there were peoples who lived in the north during warmer epochs, whether human ancestors, distant hominins, or entirely separate lineages of early humanity, their remains would struggle to survive in the geological churn of the poles. And so, the Arctic becomes a blank page on which myth and science both attempt to write. Anthropologists studying circumpolar cultures note shared motifs: skyborne beings, radiant visitors, lands of eternal light, ancestral refugees preserved from catastrophe. The Sami, Inuit, and various Siberian peoples tell of journeys across landscapes altered by fire or flood, of migrations driven by celestial changes, of teachers from distant luminous realms. None of this proves Hyperborea as a real kingdom of ageless beings, but it suggests that the high north carried symbolic weight across multiple traditions, a space associated with beginnings, refuge, or transcendence. much as the Greeks imagined. The historical imagination often gravitates toward lost civilizations at the equator, warm lands of stone monuments and river valleys. But the polar regions hold mysteries of a different kind. Not grand ruins, but erasure. Not architecture, but absence. The idea of Hyperborea lingers because it occupies this absence so perfectly. It suggests that in a time before ice, before memory, a culture may have flourished in a landscape we can scarcely picture. A world bathed in long light, then frozen, concealed, preserved only in the faintest threads of myth. Whether such a people ever walked the ancient Arctic, or whether Hyperborea is only the glimmer of a dream woven into Greek cosmology, the effect is the same. It draws us toward the unknown. It invites us to imagine a chapter of Earth's story written in climates now lost, erased by a shift so extreme that even the land itself transformed. And as the polar winds sweep across desolate plains where forests once swayed, another question begins to crystallize like frost on stone. If myths preserve even the faintest outline of a forgotten northern world, what else might lie hidden beneath ice that has not melted in a million years? There are questions that drift into the mind only when the world grows quiet, when night settles and thought loosens its grip on certainty. One such question arises when we consider the stories of the Earth's polar edges. If a northern realm like Hyperborea could persist as a half-remembered echo across centuries, what of its counterpart in the vast white silence to the south? Antarctica, a continent sealed beneath ice more than a mile thick, appears to us as a place beyond history. Pure, untouched, uninhabited. Yet its geology tells a very different tale. Beneath the frozen crust lie mountain ranges as old as the Appalachians, valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, and hints of ancient forests entombed in perennial frost. The ice, ancient as it is not eternal. There were ages when Antarctica supported rivers, deltas, and rich ecosystems. Eras long before humans walked upright. Eras when the continent was neither barren nor hidden, but a thriving piece of Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent. The question that troubles many who study this distant land is not whether it was once warm, but how dramatically it changed, and what such a transformation might conceal. The ice sheet that now covers Antarctica began forming roughly 34 million years ago, expanding until it erased most traces of the climate it replaced. Glaciation is a ruthless archivist. It crushes, grinds, pulverizes. Whatever lived upon the land was swept away or buried beneath pressure that turns mountains to dust. And yet, even in this frozen vault, there are moments of revelation. Fossilized remains of beech trees, ferns, and insects have been found in exposed rock. Petrified wood lies embedded in cliffs that peek through the ice. These remnants whisper of a time when the southern continent was anything but barren. Modern curiosity has often collided with the limits of accessibility. In the 20th century, explorers ventured into Antarctica's interior, returning with tales of strange optical illusions, mirages of mountains that seemed too regular, too carved, too geometric. The rational explanation lies in the peculiar bending of light across cold air layers, creating illusions known as fata morgana. Yet for those who stand in the stillness and watch impossible shapes hover above the ice, it is difficult not to feel the pull of imagination. What lies beneath miles of frozen silence? Could entire landscapes, cliffs, valleys, even remnants of long-lost coastlines be entombed beneath ice as effectively as memory is buried beneath time? The allure deepened in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Operation High Jump, a vast U.S. Navy expedition led by Admiral Richard Byrd, journeyed to Antarctica. Officially, the expedition aimed to establish research bases and test military equipment in extreme conditions. But its scale, nearly 5,000 men, aircraft carriers, submarines, spawned conspiracy theories that something more elusive lay beneath the mission. Byrd himself, in later interviews, made cryptic remarks about an enemy capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, statements that many interpret as metaphoric or exaggerated. Still, speculation flourished. If the poles are places where the Earth's magnetic field behaves strangely, if compasses falter and aircraft instruments drift, then perhaps they serve as thresholds, regions where certain truths about the planet remain obscured, protected by nature's own austerity. Beyond the sensationalism lies a quieter, more grounded mystery. Beneath Antarctica's ice sheet are lakes, over 400 of them, kept liquid by pressure and geothermal heat. The most famous, Lake Vostok, lies trapped beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice, untouched by sunlight for perhaps 15 million years. When scientists drilled into it, they found microbial life, simple, resilient, adapted to an environment sealed off from the surface since long before humans existed. These life forms speak not of lost civilizations, but of Earth's capacity for surprise, its ability to nurture ecosystems in places we once believed barren. It forces us to reconsider what might persist beneath the ice, in valleys and mountain ranges that no instrument has yet revealed in full. And still, the speculative imagination lingers. Some point to the Piri Reis map of 1513, created by an Ottoman admiral who compiled sources from explorers, navigators, and perhaps older charts. Part of the map appears to depict a southern landmass with a coastline reminiscent of Antarctica, without the ice. Mainstream scholarship attributes this to mapping errors, distortions common in pre-modern cartography, or misinterpretations of South America's extended coastline. Yet the coincidence continues to intrigue. Could ancient navigators have reached southern latitudes unknown to history? Could the image reflect older knowledge, fragments of seafaring traditions lost in time? No firm evidence supports the existence of an ancient civilization in Antarctica, and responsible inquiry must honor that truth. Yet the continent, with all its silence, secrecy, and violence of transformation, invites a deeper question. Not about hidden kingdoms beneath the ice, but about erasure itself. What remains after a land freezes for millions of years? What traces of life, culture, or catastrophe survive pressures so immense they reshape the crust of the earth? And if the South once knew warmth and forests and rivers, if it carried stories now buried beyond reach, how would we recognize those stories today? Would we find them in myths of southern lands swallowed by cold, in maps drawn from forgotten sources, in the hunger we feel to understand what lies beyond human memory? As the winds sweep across the white expanse and the auroras shimmer above a land that has forgotten its own past, the mind drifts toward a final, troubling wonder. If the Earth has rewritten Antarctica so completely, what else? What histories? What worlds? Might it have buried beneath ice and silence, far beyond the reach of our fragile knowing? There are moments when the Earth's story feels less like a chronicle and more like a palimpsest. Layers written, erased, overwritten, each new script obscuring the last. The deeper we look, the more the familiar narrative of human emergence begins to waver. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the tales that speak of worlds beneath our own. Across continents and millennia, countless traditions whisper of subterranean realms, hidden chambers where the wise retreated during cataclysms, tunnels that slip beneath mountains and deserts, sanctuaries preserved from the upheavals that reshape the surface. The names vary: Agartha, Shambhala, Patala, the Duat, the underworld of the Hopi. But the motif is curiously resilient. It suggests not darkness or death alone, but refuge, continuity, and knowledge carried through ages of loss. Could it be that such stories reflect more than imagination? Could they hint at migrations, shelters, or cultural havens whose traces lie beyond the ordinary reach of archaeology? In ancient India, the concept of Patala described a vast realm beneath the earth, inhabited not by the dead, but by beings of luminous power. The Nagas, serpentine guardians of hidden wisdom. Hindu and Buddhist texts speak of intricate subterranean cities connected by networks known only to initiates, insulated from the cycles of destruction that periodically sweep the surface. In Tibet, the notion of Shambhala, part physical, part spiritual, offered a vision of a hidden kingdom accessible only to those of inner clarity. Some traditions place its entrances in remote Himalayan valleys, others in caverns veiled by snow and mist. Although these descriptions belong to myth and metaphysics, they echo surprisingly far from Asia. Among the Hopi of the American Southwest, oral histories recount how their ancestors survived previous world-ending events by descending into the earth, guided by the ant people, benevolent beings who sheltered them in chambers during times of fire and flood. When the surface was safe again, the people emerged through a sipapu, a symbolic opening that remains central to their cosmology. These parallels do not suggest a literal network of underground kingdoms stretching across hemispheres. Rather, they highlight a deep-seated human intuition that beneath the fragile crust of the world lies memory, safety, preservation. Cultures that endured earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or climate swings understood the earth not only as a surface to inhabit, but as a body with depths, caves, lava tubes, hollows, places that could shield life when the sky became hostile. Archaeology confirms that humans have taken refuge underground during environmental stress. In Cappadocia, vast underground cities like Derinkuyu and Kaymakli reveal levels of complexity that challenge modern assumptions. Carved into volcanic tuff, these labyrinths include ventilation shafts, granaries, stables, and living quarters that descend multiple stories below ground. They were not mere hideouts, but engineered environments capable of sustaining thousands for extended periods. Their exact origins are murky. While most scholars date their expansion to the Byzantine period, some tunnels may be far older, repurposed across generations as threats shifted and societies changed. Elsewhere, the Earth hides similar mysteries. In the Amazon, LiDAR surveys have revealed networks of geometric earthworks, circles, squares, avenues, once dismissed as natural features beneath the rainforest canopy. Some structures connect to subterranean passages or pits that hint at rituals or communal shelters. In Europe, from Scotland to Slovenia, ancient souterrains and underground chambers perplex archaeologists with their apparent lack of consistent function. Storage, ritual, refuge, or fragments of traditions whose meanings eroded long before writing took hold. These spaces evoke the sense of a forgotten logic, a pattern of behavior repeated across cultures when surface life became unstable. But perhaps the most provocative clues lie not in myth or architecture, but in geology itself. Across the world, large volcanic tubes extend for kilometers beneath the surface, hollow corridors left behind by flowing lava. Some are wide enough to shelter entire communities. In the distant past, when climates oscillated unpredictably, such formations would have offered stable temperatures and protection from predators, storms, or cosmic events. While there is no evidence of ancient civilizations living permanently in these tunnels, the possibility that early humans or pre-human ancestors sought sanctuary within them during environmental crises is not unreasonable. And if survival once depended on descent into the earth, could the memory of such refuge have transformed over countless retellings into the mythic realms we now call underworlds? Still, even myths that echo real survival strategies carry more elusive undertones. The stories of Agartha, Shambhala, and Patala speak not only of shelter, but of wisdom preserved from cycles of destruction. They suggest that knowledge, spiritual, technological, or ancestral, might be hidden away during times of collapse, waiting to re-emerge when the world is ready. It is tempting to interpret this symbolically as allegories of inner refuge or moral continuity. Yet a quieter question persists. If countless human cultures have disappeared, leaving behind only shards of pottery and stray carvings, might some of their teachings or memories have traveled in ways that do not fossilize, carried through migration, encoded in myth, protected in spaces where records cannot easily be erased? The earth beneath us is vast, largely unmapped, and largely unfathomed. Cave systems extend deeper than our instruments easily track, and in many regions, sediment and tectonic shifts obscure whatever the past left behind. Perhaps the stories of subterranean realms endure because they capture a truth we sense but cannot name, that the planet holds more history than the surface reveals. And as we contemplate the corridors carved by nature and by human hands alike, the mind drifts toward a lingering wonder. If knowledge has been preserved before, in the quiet dark, what might still lie waiting? Silent, untouched, and patient in chambers we have not yet dared to find. There are times when the planet feels like a vast instrument, its surface humming with patterns too large for any single lifetime to perceive. We sense these patterns only in fragments, odd alignments of ancient monuments, recurring motifs etched into stone, myths repeating across oceans as though carried by an unseen current. When studied separately, each fragment seems innocent, but when placed side by side, they begin to form a faint geometry, a web of knowledge older than writing, perhaps older than agriculture itself. At the heart of this web lies a question few dare to voice aloud. How did ancient cultures scattered across continents, with no known contact, build structures that echo one another so closely in form, orientation, and cosmic ambition? Pyramids in Egypt rising like steps toward the sky, pyramids in Mexico aligning with solstices, platform temples in China and Indonesia mirroring celestial patterns, mounds in North America shaped with astonishing geometric precision. Is this convergence merely coincidence, an inevitable outcome of human creativity, or evidence of something more elusive, a shared inheritance from a forgotten epoch? The idea is not that these cultures exchanged blueprints across oceans thousands of years before maritime technology could carry them so far. Anthropologists caution against overreaching parallels, reminding us that humans everywhere observe the sky, revere their dead, and seek the stability of triangular forms. Yet even within this reasonable framework, there are anomalies that refuse to settle neatly. Consider the alignment of the pyramids at Giza with the stars of Orion's belt, a correspondence some scholars argue reflects the celestial landscape as it appeared around 10,500 BCE, far earlier than orthodox dating of the structures. Or the layout of Teotihuacan in Mexico, whose Avenue of the Dead runs slightly askew from the cardinal directions, mirroring celestial inclinations similar to Egyptian sites. These echoes could be symbolic rather than literal, coincidences shaped by independent astronomical traditions. But the feeling they evoke lingers, a sense that ancient builders shared a worldview in which the sky served not only as calendar, but as mirror, temple, and teacher. The puzzle deepens when we look beneath the surface, literally. Across the globe, mathematical and geometric knowledge appears in contexts that suggest sophistication beyond what we expect of ancient societies. The builders of Stonehenge understood the 19-year metonic cycle of the moon. The Maya tracked Venus with a precision rivaling modern instruments. The Indus Valley civilization laid out cities on grids aligned to cardinal directions, with standardized weights and measures. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines encoded astronomical information stretching back tens of thousands of years, mapping both the land and the heavens in ways that blur the line between myth and science. These achievements do not imply a vanished global civilization. They demonstrate instead that human cultures, when rooted deeply in place and sky, develop intricate knowledge systems that can rival one another across continents. Still, a kind of resonance persists, a shared architectural vocabulary that feels inexplicable in its recurrence. The stepped pyramids of Mesopotamia echo in the terraced sanctuaries of South America. The megalithic circles of Britain find distant cousins in the stone rings of Nabta Playa in Egypt, and the less famous but equally intriguing alignments of Peru's Chanquillo complex, whose 13 towers track the sun's annual journey with remarkable accuracy. These patterns raise the possibility that the human impulse to shape stone into cosmic instruments arises from some deeper inheritance, perhaps a memory of upheavals once witnessed, or of cycles observed long before our current era began. Some researchers, studying glacial melt records and astronomical cycles, suggest that ancient peoples might have been responding to environmental dangers we have forgotten. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions around 12,900 years ago, thrust the world into chaos with astonishing speed. Sea levels surged, climate shifted, megafauna vanished. Human communities living through such an event would have sought patterns in the sky to predict the next catastrophe. Perhaps the alignments and orientations we see in ancient monuments reflect this vigilance, a way to track solstices, equinoxes, and stellar risings that foretold seasonal stability or upheaval. Knowledge gained under duress can become sacred, passed down through ritual and architecture, surviving long after the memory of the disaster fades. Yet there is a more haunting possibility, one that drifts between the lines of myth and archaeology. What if some of this knowledge did not originate solely from the cultures that preserved it? What if it was inherited, carried forward from earlier communities whose traces were mostly erased by time, leaving only the faintest imprint in stone? This does not require imagining a single grand civilization, but rather a series of cultural blooms scattered across continents, rising during warmer epochs, falling during colder ones, sharing thematic echoes through migrations, oral traditions, and the universal human need to make sense of a turbulent world. As we walk among the ruins, at Giza, at Teotihuacan, at Borobudur, at Chanquillo, the stones seem to whisper of patterns half forgotten. They invite us to imagine a planet where humans lived closer to the rhythms of sky and earth, where architecture served as a bridge between survival and meaning. And as twilight gathers around these ancient forms, another question arises quietly, as if on the breath of the wind. What hidden chapter of human knowledge lies behind this persistent geometry, this cosmic order carved into stone by hands long vanished? There are stretches of history where the silence feels engineered, as though someone or something once swept a broad hand across the page and removed entire chapters before the ink had time to dry. This feeling emerges most strongly when we confront the ruins of cultures that appear abruptly in the archaeological record, fully formed, with craftsmanship that seems to have no clear evolutionary path. One such case lies on the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where the ancient city of Sarazm in modern Tajikistan rose around the 4th millennium BCE. When excavated, it revealed metallurgy of exceptional refinement, intricate pottery, and architecture arranged with an orderliness that implied long-standing traditions. Yet its origins are murky, its antecedents unclear. Cultures do not typically appear this suddenly unless they draw from older lineages that in this case remain troublingly absent. The same phenomenon hovers around the mysterious Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, a Bronze Age world of fortified cities, richly adorned graves, and elaborate iconography spread across present-day Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. Its sophistication is undeniable. Its connections to surrounding cultures complex, yet its developmental roots feel strangely obscured, as though time has hidden the steps that led to its flowering. This pattern of sudden emergence followed by equally sudden disappearance is not unique to Central Asia. In Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk surged into prominence around 3500 BCE, with monumental architecture, administrative tablets, and complex social structures. Archaeologically, preludes exist, but the scale of the leap remains startling. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa appeared with standardized brickwork, grid-planned streets, and sophisticated water systems unmatched for millennia. Yet their writing system remains undeciphered, their political organization unknown, and their collapse still debated. The impression, faint but persistent, is of civilizations rising like islands from a fog, a dense haze in which earlier attempts, prototypes, or smaller communities may have existed, but from which almost nothing survived to tell the story. Then there's the enigma of Tartessos, a civilization of southwestern Iberia spoken of by Greeks as wealthy, literate, and culturally unique. Its artifacts, intricate goldwork, stylized metal bowls, and distinctive geometric motifs are unlike those of nearby cultures, suggesting a heritage either deeply local or partially inherited from influences now lost. Some ancient writers placed Tartessos at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, describing its people as intermediaries between the Atlantic world and the Mediterranean. Yet despite centuries of search, its cities remain elusive. Trade goods and inscriptions survive, but the core of Tartessos feels hidden behind a veil, tantalizing and incomplete, as though submerged beneath layers of later settlement and shifting river patterns that erased what once stood plainly in view. The sense of erasure grows sharper when we consider the puzzles scattered across Europe's megalithic traditions. Stone circles, long barrows, dolmens. Their builders left no written records, yet their structures align with astronomical cycles and ritual patterns that indicate a deep continuity of thought. These monuments, some predating both pyramids and Stonehenge, emerge from communities whose social complexity our narratives often underestimate, and yet for all their cultural richness, the record of their daily lives is faint. Wood decays, bone dissolves in acidic soils, textiles vanish. What remains are stones, mute testimonies of beliefs and practices that once connected landscapes across thousands of kilometers. The more we examine these remnants, the more we sense that much of early human culture unfolded beyond the reach of preservation. Across these disparate places, Tajikistan, the Indus Valley, Iberia, Neolithic Europe, a subtle pattern takes shape. Sudden appearances, cultural flowering, partial preservation, and then disappearance into silence. Historians typically attribute these gaps to environmental change, migration, or social restructuring. Yet the effect is cumulative, almost as if deep time has conspired to hide the connective tissue that once linked these bursts of civilization to deeper roots. It raises a difficult question. Are we witnessing genuine origins, or only the surviving tips of cultural icebergs whose larger masses melted away long before archaeology could recover them? Even the Roman Empire, arguably one of the best documented ancient civilizations, lost knowledge after its fall. Engineering techniques, architectural formulas, and administrative systems that took centuries to rediscover. If such losses occurred in a culture with extensive writing and monumental stonework, imagine what could vanish from societies that relied on oral tradition or fragile materials. Imagine what could disappear from cultures located in floodplains, coastal regions, or areas prone to earthquakes and volcanic activity. Entire libraries could be washed away. Entire cities buried beneath silt. Entire lineages of artisans, astronomers, or navigators forgotten before a single record was etched in clay or copper. This realization deepens the sense of unease. If our understanding of even the most recent ancient civilizations is marked by absence, what could lie beyond the thin veil of the archaeological record? What if the cultural blooms we identify as the first are only those fortunate enough to survive environmental cycles, while earlier attempts, experiments in social organization, technology, or cosmology, vanished without leaving visible traces? And if the Earth itself has overwritten so many of its own stories, what fragments remain, scattered in ways we have yet to interpret, waiting for the moment when chance or curiosity brings them back into light? There are chapters of the human story that feel less like missing pages and more like entire books withdrawn from the shelf, leaving only an outline in the dust. Nowhere does this sensation grow stronger than when we turn to the vast, often overlooked regions that bridged continents, corridors of movement, exchange, and transformation, whose significance flickers faintly through the archaeological record. The Eurasian steppe, stretching from Romania to Mongolia, is one such corridor. It is a landscape of grass and sky, where nomadic cultures rode in waves across millennia, carrying ideas, technologies, and memories from one horizon to another. Yet the steppe is also a graveyard of perishable history. Wood rots. Tents leave no foundation. Burials, when shallow, erode under wind and frost. What survives are fragments. Kurgans filled with goldwork, so refined it seems out of place. Remnants of composite bows, whose power shaped empires. Horse remains that speak of early domestication, but not the stories of those who rode them. Among these fragments lies the mystery of the Yamnaya, a people who emerged around 3300 BCE and whose influence radiated across the continent with startling speed. Genetic research reveals that their migrations reshaped the demographics of Europe and South Asia, carrying with them languages that would become the roots of many spoken today. Yet their culture, its myths, its social structures, its cosmology, remains elusive. They left no cities, no monumental architecture, no written texts. What we know comes from burial mounds, ochre-dusted bones, stone stelae with abstract carvings, traces of wagons that hint at long-distance travel. How does a people with so little material footprint exert such enormous influence? And if their legacy scattered across continents so thoroughly, what of the cultures who may have come before them or alongside them, whose traces did not fossilize in bone or gold? A similar ambiguity surrounds the Scythians, famed for their horsemanship and feared by empires as formidable warriors. Greek historians wrote of their mobility, their mastery of archery, their nomadic freedoms. Herodotus described their burial rites, their reverence for sky and steppe, their isolation from the sedentary world. Yet the Scythians, too, remain half hidden. Their art, exquisite gold ornaments shaped into stylized animals, suggests a symbolic system rich with meaning, but its grammar is lost. Their stories, once sung around fires on endless plains, dissolved into the air long before writing reached them. Even their origins blur into a haze of overlapping migrations and vanished traditions. What remains are tombs frozen in Siberian permafrost, mummies preserved in felt garments, tattoos inked into centuries-old skin, remnants of daily life trapped in ice. These glimpses are precious, but partial, as though the steppe allows only fleeting looks into a world that once thrived in motion. Other steppe cultures complicate the picture further. The Sarmatians, renowned for their female warriors, may have seeded the Greek myths of the Amazons. The Xiongnu, long considered precursors to the Huns, built alliances and confederations rivaling early Chinese states, yet their political structures remain poorly understood. Archaeologists uncover kurgans with astonishing wealth, silver vessels, weapons with intricate inlays, textiles dyed in vivid hues, yet the societies that created them remain shadowed. Their histories exist mostly as reflections in the writings of their adversaries. They were children of horizons, their knowledge transmitted orally, their identities shaped by landscapes that preserved almost nothing of their presence except what they chose to bury with their dead. This fragility extends beyond the steppe. In the lush forests of Southeast Asia, the vast city of Angkor lay concealed beneath jungle vines for centuries, its reservoirs and highways swallowed by green. Only with modern LiDAR did the true scale of Angkor's urban complexity emerge. Grids, canals, neighborhoods, agricultural systems stretching farther than anyone imagined. How many other forested civilizations remain veiled, their wooden structures and earthen foundations dissolved into soil? In the rainforests of the Amazon, LiDAR has revealed geoglyphs and road systems, suggesting societies far more organized than once believed. Their settlements, built largely from earth and timber, decayed into the forest floor, leaving only faint imprints detectable from the air. What ties these diverse places together is not a shared culture, but a shared vulnerability. Civilizations built in wood rather than stone, in plains rather than mountains, in forests rather than deserts, leave shadows rather than monuments. Their knowledge may have equal depth to that of cities carved from limestone, yet their traces were softer, more perishable, more easily erased by wind, water, and time. And so, the archaeological record becomes skewed towards societies that built in rock, lived in dry climates, or left inscriptions that resisted decay. The rest, cultures of equal complexity, travelers of equal ingenuity, fade into the background, leaving behind only hints: a shard, a burial, a pattern in the soil. This recognition invites a troubling contemplation. If entire civilizations of the last 5,000 years can nearly vanish without a ripple, if cultures whose influence shaped continents leave only fragmentary evidence, then what of the deeper past? What of communities that may have flourished during warmer interglacial periods tens of thousands or tens of thousands upon thousands of years ago? The steppe, the jungle, the floodplain, the coast, these are landscapes that both nurture life and erase its traces. Their soil swallows wood. Their rivers rearrange land. Their seasons bury and uncover in endless cycles. Standing on the open grasslands where ancient writers once carried stories now lost, a faint unease settles in. not fear, but a quiet awareness. The narrative we call history is shaped as much by forgetting as by remembrance. What we know depends on what survived, and what survived depends on chance. As the wind stirs across the steppe and dusk gathers at the horizon, one question rises like a whispered echo. If so much of the recent past lies hidden, how many more voices from the deeper ages of Earth are waiting, erased by time, yet lingering just beyond the edge of discovery? There are landscapes where the Earth seems to shift beneath the weight of stories we are no longer equipped to read, where memory clings not to inscriptions or monuments, but to patterns so subtle that they blur into coincidence. Among these landscapes, none is more perplexing than the vast web of star-shaped forts scattered across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Their geometry, radiating bastions, interlocking angles, labyrinths of moats and ramparts, appears almost modern in its sophistication. Yet many of these structures predate the scientific age they are often credited to. Some were indeed built in the Renaissance, when military engineers codified the star fort design against the rising power of cannons. But others seem older, their origins debated, their purposes unclear. They appear in places with no record of major sieges, in regions where technology did not necessitate such designs, and sometimes, most curiously, beneath layers of later construction, as though the land had been reused, reshaped, built over a forgotten foundation. Take, for instance, the star-shaped earthworks in the Netherlands and France, whose perfect angles suggest a precision difficult to achieve without aerial perspective. Or those found deeper inland, fortifications in Eastern Europe whose dates remain contested, some perhaps earlier than expected, others rebuilt so many times that their original form is obscured. Even in the Americas, star-shaped structures appear in unexpected contexts. Pre-colonial mound complexes in North America, whose radiating patterns echo defensive layouts not typically associated with indigenous warfare, and earthworks in Brazil, whose geometric plans hint at cultural practices lost long before Europeans arrived. In each case, the origins blur. Some might be remnants of early modern military architecture. Others might reflect ritual or astronomical functions. And still, others may have emerged independently from a symbolic logic we no longer understand. This ambiguity deepens when we consider the fragmented archives of the early modern world. Wars, fires, and political upheavals erased countless records. Maps were redrawn, territories renamed, and fortifications dismantled or absorbed into new cities. The Napoleonic campaigns alone transformed the geography of Europe, altering landscapes and repurposing ancient designs. The 30 Years' War left towns in ruins, their defensive outlines reshaped in reconstruction. And long before these upheavals, the migrations of the medieval and late antique periods swept across continents, burying older layers beneath new ones. The result is a palimpsest so dense that untangling the lineage of any particular structure becomes an exercise in navigating centuries of silence. The intrigue surrounding these geometric forms sometimes veers into conjecture, claims that they represent energy grids, forgotten technologies, or remnants of a global civilization obscured by later eras. Yet the truth may be subtler and more revealing. Geometry itself is a language one humans throughout history have discovered and rediscovered. Triangles offer stability. Circles offer symbolism. Stars offer both. The repetition of these forms across continents may indicate not a single origin, but a shared human intuition about space, defense, and the sacred. Still, it is difficult to ignore the unease that settles in when we observe how frequently these forms appear in places far from the centers of historical military innovation, or how often they seem to predate the cultures credited with building them. The question grows sharper when paired with a broader pattern: the disappearance of architectural knowledge. Ancient Romans engineered concrete formulas that remained unmatched for centuries. Medieval builders constructed vaulted cathedrals whose methods became obscure after their guilds dissolved. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without written charts. Guided by a star compass few outside their tradition could decipher. Knowledge rises, peaks and falls, leaving behind artifacts whose meaning we struggle to reconstruct. If such losses occurred in well-documented eras, how many more cycles of mastery and forgetting might have unfolded in the deeper past, in ages without writing, or in regions where humidity, war, or colonization erased the evidence? Then there are the cities that seem almost too vast for their time. The immense earthen complexes of Cahokia in North America, with their plaza aligned to solstices. The planned capitals of ancient Southeast Asia, whose hydraulic systems spanned entire landscapes. The sprawling settlement beneath modern-day Xi'an, whose full extent remains unexcavated. Each of these places suggests a level of organization that does not align neatly with the narratives we inherited. And in their shadows, we sense the presence of older layers. Communities built and abandoned, rebuilt and forgotten. As we move deeper into these questions, the line between pattern and coincidence begins to blur. Are these star-shaped forms, these geometric echoes, these abrupt leaps in architectural ambition, the product of shared human cognition? Or do they hint at earlier experiments, local, dispersed, perhaps short-lived, that flickered into brilliance and then faded, leaving only imprints later cultures adopted unknowingly? Standing before these enigmatic shapes, carved into soil and stone, we find ourselves suspended between skepticism and wonder. The land asks us to observe, to question, to consider how often the past outpaces our expectations. And as twilight settles over forts whose histories have partially dissolved, a quieter question emerges, difficult to articulate, harder still to ignore. If the earth remembers in geometry what it forgets in stone, what hidden lineage of ideas might be threaded through these shapes, waiting for us to understand their deeper origin? There are stretches of history where the air feels heavy with erasure, where the artifacts we recover seem less like remnants of a known world and more like survivors of a forgotten one. In these places, the line between what once existed and what has been overwritten becomes almost impossible to trace. Nowhere does this ambiguity gather more force than in the ancient knowledge systems that flicker through fragments of myth, in symbols carved into stone, in astronomical traditions that seem disproportionate to the material culture that surrounds them. This dissonance is unsettling. Cultures with rudimentary tools charting celestial cycles with uncanny precision. Societies that leave simple pottery yet orient monuments to equinoxes and lunar standstills with mathematical rigor. How did such knowledge arise, and why does it appear in sudden isolated bursts, fully formed, then vanishing again, leaving only starlight and silence in its wake? The Dogon people of Mali offer one such riddle. Their cosmology, recorded in the 20th century by ethnographers Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen, contains references to the star Sirius and its invisible companion, Sirius B, a dense white dwarf unseen by the naked eye. According to the Dogon, this knowledge was inherited from ancestral teachings, embedded in rituals and symbols. Skeptics argue that contamination from earlier Western contact is more likely. Observers cannot discount the possibility that such knowledge entered Dogon tradition through indirect channels. Yet the persistence of the narrative raises a different question. Why do so many cultures anchor profound stories in the stars, encoding intricate cycles into mythic frameworks that seem out of step with their technological environments? A similar puzzle appears in ancient India, the Vedanga Jyotisha. An early text on astronomy includes calculations and cosmological models that imply sophisticated observation across centuries. The precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's rotation taking nearly 26,000 years to complete, appears encoded in Vedic lore not as a scientific formula, but as a symbolic cycle of ages. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tracked Venus with such precision that their observations differ only by seconds from modern measurements. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators memorized star paths stretching across thousands of kilometers, mapping the ocean through a fusion of intuition, inherited knowledge, and disciplined training. These achievements do not require ancient global civilizations or vanished technologies. They show instead that human observation, when refined over generations, can reach exceptional heights. Yet, the pattern remains. The most sophisticated knowledge often appears in places where the material record is sparse or fragile, where the structures that might have contextualized such understanding have long since eroded into dust. And then there is sound, another thread of ancient mastery. In Malta, the Hal Saflieni hypogeum contains chambers with acoustic properties so precise they amplify low frequencies in ways modern engineers still study. In Peru, the stone galleries of Chavin de Huantar Channel sound like a labyrinth of resonant tunnels, designed to produce otherworldly effects during ritual ceremonies. In both cases, the knowledge embedded in architecture suggests experimentation, intention, and transmission of ideas through means that did not survive as texts. These structures feel like echoes of a wider ancient awareness, one attuned not only to stone and sky, but to vibration itself. Such fragments, separated by vast distances and millennia, tempt us to weave them into a single story. But the truth may be more nuanced. Human societies, especially those without writing, encode knowledge in ways that bypass the archaeological record. Oral tradition, ritual practice, and symbolic representation can carry insights that appear sudden only because earlier iterations left no trace. And yet, the recurrence of similar motifs across continents, spirals, serpents, cosmic trees, sun disks, twin guardians, whispers of a deeper resonance, a convergence of thought that might reflect shared cognitive patterns or inherited fragments from primal migrations. Still, the most troubling aspect lies not in what we can see, but in what remains absent. Every ancient knowledge system we have uncovered seems to emerge from a lineage we cannot fully reconstruct. There are always missing predecessors, lost mentors whose teachings never fossilized, vanished societies whose contributions now masquerade as spontaneous revelations. The Vedic astronomers surely drew from earlier observers. The Maya, from generations of skywatchers whose names are lost. The Dogon, from ancestral lineages erased by time. The continuity is undeniable. The origins remain opaque. This pattern forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the earliest expressions of human cognition, a fusion of myth, science, ritual, and observation, flourished in epochs when environmental instability repeatedly erased the physical evidence. Ice ages, floods, volcanic winters. Each could erase centuries of accumulated insight, leaving only those fragments embedded in stories, stars, and stones that withstand catastrophe. Knowledge can survive without its containers, but when the containers vanish, origins blur into shadows. As night deepens over the silent desert, the high plateau, the forest canopy, these scattered fragments begin to feel like the faint glow of a distant fire, evidence not of a single forgotten civilization, but of many forgotten beginnings. And as we contemplate these resilient sparks flickering across continents and ages, a quiet wonder presses in. If ancient knowledge survives in whispers long after its makers have vanished, what fuller tapestry might have once existed, now dissolved into myth, waiting for us to relearn what our ancestors once knew? There are stretches of ancient memory that seem to hover at the boundaries between worlds, where myth bleeds into history, and history dissolves into something older, stranger, more elusive. As we move deeper into these borderlands, we encounter symbols and stories that appear less like inventions of isolated cultures and more like recurring motifs passed along through unseen channels. Serpents coiled around cosmic trees, floodbringers who reshape the earth, radiant beings who teach agriculture or astronomy, islands of light swallowed by rising seas. These figures wander from continent to continent, assuming new names but carrying familiar shapes. They appear in the lore of the Maya as the feathered serpent, in Sumer as the Apkallu, the wise ones rising from the waters, in Greece as the civilizing sons of Apollo, in Polynesia as culture heroes who descended on canoes from distant realms. Patterns that should not overlap do, forming a quiet geometry of shared memory. Some argue this reflects deep psychological archetypes, symbols rooted in the human mind. Others wonder if the real explanation is simpler and more subtle. Ancient people told stories about real events, real migrations, real catastrophes, and those memories, carried for millennia, evolved into myth. One of the most persistent threads in this tapestry is the memory of a world-ending flood. Not just in Mesopotamia, not just in the Bible, but across Aboriginal Australia, among the Haida of the Pacific Northwest, in the Andean highlands, throughout Southeast Asia. Some tales speak of rising seas swallowing coastlines, others of torrents unleashed by melting ice or distant storms. For centuries, scholars treated such stories as metaphor, Yet climate science now reveals that at the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, drowning continental shelves where early humans likely lived. Sundaland, once a vast expanse connecting Indonesia to mainland Asia, now lies submerged beneath warm tropical waters. Doggerland, once a lush land bridge between Britain and Europe, vanished beneath the North Sea. Could it be that humanity's flood myths are the last echoes of those drowned worlds, preserved long after their cities, tools, and paths were erased? But even if these myths preserve real events, they also carry something deeper, an insistence that knowledge came from elsewhere, from luminous ancestors or distant lands now lost. In ancient Sumer, the first kings were said to be instructed by beings who emerged from the sea bearing wisdom. In Egypt, Thoth and Osiris were described as civilizers from far journeys. In the Andes, Viracocha appeared after a cataclysm to teach and rebuild. These narratives do not require supernatural beings. They could reflect migrations from cultures more advanced in specific crafts or cosmologies. But what troubles the historical imagination is how widespread the theme becomes. Why do so many traditions speak of teachers arriving after destruction, guiding the survivors toward agriculture, architecture, or law? Why does the motif of loss, followed by instruction, echo through so many timelines? Perhaps the answer lies in the cyclical nature of human settlement itself. When environmental collapse struck, whether through drought, volcanic winters, or rising seas, communities splintered. Some fled, some adapted, some perished. Those who traveled may have carried knowledge from older, more stable environments, farming techniques, celestial observation, the memory of cities buried beneath water or ash. To the survivors in new lands, such knowledge would have seemed almost mythical. Over generations, the bearers of wisdom became ancestors to be revered, and the migrations that carried them were transformed into cosmic journeys. Their teachers elevated from human figures into culture heroes and gods. Yet there is a quieter possibility, one embedded in the geological record itself. There were times in Earth's prehistory when climate volatility was so extreme that stable settlements could not endure for long. A culture might rise, flourish briefly, then fall to drought or shifting coastlines. Its memory fractured into diaspora. Later generations might rebuild with fewer resources or under new conditions, losing parts of the older knowledge. The earliest chapters of human organization may have unfolded in regions now submerged or transformed beyond recognition, leaving behind only the mythic residue of a world more complex than the archaeological record suggests. Even today, the ocean conceals nearly all of the coastlines where early humans lived. During the Ice Age, the most fertile lands were not inland, but along shores now lost to the sea. Whatever unfolded in those vanished regions, trade networks, settlements, experiments in early social structure, remains inaccessible until deep-sea archaeology advances far beyond its current state. And so, the ancient stories persist, carrying within them hints of migrations and disasters we can barely reconstruct. We cannot dismiss the possibility that our ancestors preserved, in metaphor and ritual, memories so ancient they predate known civilizations by thousands of years. As we stand on the edge of this vast uncertainty, where myth touches the submerged margins of prehistory, another thought takes shape. If the human mind can carry echoes across 10 millennia, if cultures separated by oceans share symbolic memories of teachers, floods, and vanished lands, what else might be encoded in these stories? What fragments of forgotten epics might hide behind metaphors we have grown too literal to interpret? And if myth is, in part, a map, drawn in poetry rather than ink, what lost landscapes might it point toward, still waiting beneath waves or soil, patient as the past itself? There are moments when following the faint trail of forgotten ages, when the past seems to lean toward us as though offering a hint, then withdraws before we can grasp its full outline. Nowhere does this teasing uncertainty feel stronger than in the ruins and remnants of societies whose disappearance remains unexplained, whose shadows linger not only in archaeology, but in the psychological landscape of entire regions. Across Eurasia, especially in the passages between Europe and Asia, one such shadow has inspired speculation for centuries. The idea of a great empire with no clear surviving history, a cultural horizon glimpsed only through stray architectural anomalies, fragmented maps, and ruins that seemed too grand for the communities later found living amid them. This is the enigma often whispered about in modern imagination under the name Tartaria. Though the historical Tartars and Turkic peoples bear little resemblance to the myth that has grown around the term. In truth, Tartaria never existed as a single kingdom. On historical maps, the word simply denoted vast, poorly documented regions of Inner Eurasia, where nomadic confederations rose and fell faster than cartographers could track them. Yet the idea persists, not because of political continuity, but because of the immense gaps in the record. Structures across Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe display architectural styles that appear abruptly, sometimes without clear precursors. Brickwork, whose composition hints at techniques lost after the 18th century. Arches and vaults built with a mathematical precision that would require specialized knowledge. Abandoned structures whose proportions imply builders with far more resources than the scattered communities recorded nearby. None of this proves a lost empire, but it highlights how frequently history in these regions was shaped by forces that left faint material traces. Migrations, epidemics, wars documented only in oral tradition. What intensifies the sense of mystery is the sheer scale of cultural erasure brought by time and upheaval. The Mongol invasions, the Black Death, the collapse of the Golden Horde, the fragmentation of steppe polities, the shifting borders of Russian expansion, all contributed to waves of disruption that destroyed archives, temples, and urban centers. Wooden architecture, predominant across Siberia and Inner Asia, decays quickly, leaving only the stone foundations of unknown buildings or isolated towers whose original functions blur with each passing century. When modern researchers attempt to trace the development of these regions, they encounter an archaeological record full of holes. Cities mentioned in chronicles, but never found. Fortifications mapped in the 17th century, but now lost beneath farmland. Cultural lineages inferred from artifacts scattered across thousands of kilometers. Compounding the difficulty is the landscape itself. Permafrost entombs remains in some areas while obliterating them in others. Seasonal floods erase settlements. Steppe fires consume wooden structures in hours. River courses shift, burying older towns beneath meters of silt. When the archaeological footprint of whole populations is this fragile, the absence of evidence becomes fertile ground for speculation. And speculation, once unfettered, sometimes seeks patterns where only remnants survive. The notion of a forgotten empire, advanced or unified, can arise from a misunderstanding of how nomadic and semi-nomadic societies operate. Flexible, adaptive, decentralized, leaving behind knowledge systems not captured in the stone and parchment metrics by which settled civilizations are usually judged. Yet there is something in the story of Tartaria that touches a deeper nerve, not the conspiracy theories of erased empires, but the quieter truth hidden beneath them. That entire cultural ecosystems can vanish without leaving the kinds of traces we expect. Linguistic families fragment. Technologies based on wood, felt, and leather disappear without fossilizing. Trade networks collapse, leaving only stray beads or coins as evidence of their existence. The past becomes not a clear timeline, but a mosaic missing many of its tiles. This fragility echoes across continents. In North America, earthen mound complexes, some aligned to celestial cycles with astonishing accuracy, once stretched across the Mississippi Valley. Yet their builders left no written records. In sub-Saharan Africa, medieval urban centers like Great Zimbabwe wielded substantial political power, but remained poorly understood due to the absence of long-lasting textual traditions. In Southeast Asia, bronze casting cultures flourished for centuries, only to vanish almost entirely from archaeological visibility. These examples remind us that complexity does not always leave a durable footprint, and that the lack of surviving evidence is not proof of absence, but of environmental vulnerability. And so, when we stand before ruins whose origins elude our timelines, when we study maps that gesture toward forgotten geographies, or encounter artifacts detached from narratives, a quieter realization settles in. The earth does not preserve history evenly. It saves some lines and erases others. What remains becomes the story we tell, while what disappears leaves a void into which myth, speculation, and longing inevitably flow. Perhaps that longing itself reveals something essential, a recognition that the world we inherit is only a fraction of what once existed, and that vast chapters of human experience may lie buried under ice, forest, or fields, waiting for a chance discovery to restore them to memory. As night gathers over the plains and mountains where these forgotten cultures once moved like shifting constellations, the silence deepens. In that silence, one thought begins to stir. If entire societies can vanish so completely in the recent past, how much more might be missing from the deeper ages of Earth? Eras erased not by design, but by the quiet, relentless machinery of time. There are moments, rare and fleeting, when the haze of forgotten ages seems to thin, just enough to reveal the outline of something vast beneath it. Not a single civilization, not a lost continent, not a unified narrative that ties every anomaly into a neat design, but something far more complex. A sense that the earth has lived many lives, and that humanity's place within those lives is far less central, far less permanent than we like to imagine. By the time we reach the most recent chapters of ancient history, a strange pattern emerges. The nearer we draw to the eras we consider well understood, the more we find absences that resemble erasures, transitions that feel abrupt, cultures that rise in brilliance and fall with barely a trace. What then of the deeper past? Those unfathomable eras where the land itself shifted, where seas advanced and retreated, where entire ecosystems appeared and vanished in spans too vast for memory, yet too brief for geological permanence. This sense of layered forgetting becomes almost tangible in places where time folds in on itself. In the deserts of North Africa, for instance, beneath the wind-shaped dunes, lie remnants of ancient river channels, reminders that the Sahara was once green, crossed by lakes and forests, home to herds of animals and communities whose stone tools survive while their stories do not. Rock art scattered across the central Sahara depicts giraffes, elephants, boats drifting over water that has not existed there for thousands of years. These images do not speak of forgotten civilizations in the grandiose sense, but they reveal a world transformed so completely that even the memory of its climate has faded into myth. Farther west, along the Atlantic coast, the megalithic tombs of Portugal and Spain stand in quiet testimony to people whose beliefs centered on the movement of sun and stars. Their builders aligned these monuments to solstice light, embedding cosmic rhythms into chambers of stone. Yet the culture that raised them vanished long before written language arrived. Only alignment, orientation, and architectural intent remain, whispers of a worldview absent from the pages of recorded history. Across the globe, similar silences accumulate. In Japan, the Jomon people created pottery thousands of years before agriculture reached their islands. Sculptures of enigmatic figures whose meanings dissolve into conjecture. In the Pacific, the Lapita navigators spread across thousands of miles of ocean, then fragmented into cultures with no written record of their passage. In the Americas, the builders of the Great Serpent Mound shaped Earth into forms visible only from the sky, yet left no inscriptions explaining their purpose. Everywhere, we find signs of knowledge shaped by hands we cannot name, fragments of continuity shattered by droughts, migrations, or the slow attrition of memory. And as these fragments accumulate, a quiet question grows difficult to ignore. If so much can vanish in 10,000 years, what might have disappeared in 50,000, in 100,000, in the million-year rhythms of glacial and interglacial cycles that reshaped coastlines and buried valleys beneath ice? We speak confidently of prehistory, yet much of what we call certainty rests on a geological record that preserves less than 1% of all human habitation, and a textual record that spans only a few thin millennia. Beneath that lies a chasm, an abyss of time in which untold chapters could have unfolded, altered, been extinguished, and forgotten. Still, the story of ancient Earth is not one of conspiracies or hidden empires. It is a story of fragility. Knowledge rises and knowledge falls. Climates shift, and with them, the archives of entire peoples erode. The Earth is a restless scribe, writing and rewriting its own memory. What survives for us to study is not the totality of what once existed, but only what endured long enough to be found. As we bring this quiet journey to its end, the road does not narrow into certainty. Instead, it opens, wide and unbounded, into a horizon of unanswered questions. We have traced submerged coastlines, forgotten cities, star-aligned monuments, vanished peoples, and myths that echo across continents. Yet each clue leads not to finality, but to a deeper awareness of how much has been lost, how much remains unseen. And so the mind drifts toward a final image: the earth at dusk, its mountains casting long shadows over plains carved by forgotten rivers, its coasts whispering of lands drowned long ago, its stars glimmering above monuments whose builders have no names. In that twilight, the planet feels ancient beyond comprehension, ancient enough to have held countless worlds before ours, each rising and fading like constellations that vanish with the dawn. There is no conclusion, only a lingering wonder. If we listen closely to the silence between the stones and the stories, what deeper history might still be murmuring beneath our feet, waiting for the moment when we finally learn how to hear it? Thank you for drifting with us through these hidden corridors of time, for letting your mind wander across forgotten shores, silent ruins, and the faint traces of worlds the earth no longer speaks of openly. Your presence here shapes the journey as much as the stories themselves, and each listener becomes part of the quiet search for what lies beneath the surface of our shared past. If this exploration stirred even a single question within you, one soft enough to carry into sleep, or deep enough to follow into tomorrow, then the path ahead is already opening. When you are ready to walk further into the mysteries of our ancient world, we will be here, waiting with more whispers from the darkened layers of time. Until then, may your night be calm and your curiosity steady. Thank you for listening, and welcome always to Cryptic Realm Channel.